Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Rob Portman. I could tell you that Rob is a distinguished senator representing the Buckeye State, that he previously was a member of the House of Representatives representing Cincinnati, or that he was a U.S. trade rep and director of the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush, or that he served in the George H.W. Bush administration. But I'm not going to tell you any of that. Instead, I'm going to tell you something a little more personal, that Rob is my Dartmouth College classmate, Washington, D.C. housemate, best man at my wedding over the hill in Aspen. I'm a Democrat after all, and a dear, dear friend. And what really brought us together was something that happened just hours from here in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. In 1977, a group of us from Dartmouth's Ledyard Canoe Club hiked to the source of the Rio Grande and, with support from National Geographic, spent the next 6 months kayaking the 1,888-mile Rio Grande from source to sea, the first time the river had been navigated in its entirety. Now, Rob was not the trip's whitewater expert. There's us at the source. Uh-oh. We started in April in icy conditions up in the mountains of Colorado. Now, Rob, as I was saying, was not the trip's great whitewater expert. But he was our lead politician, always sharpening his skills, even with the youngest voters. I'll have to say the trip was not all fun and games. The river ran dry on us at many points. We had to hike, we had to drag our boats. But I have to say, it was spectacular, including the Big Bend on the 1,300-mile Texas-Mexico border. And kayaking, Texas style, was a real gas, with whitewater too thick to drink and too thin to plow. And reaching the sea was one of the most memorable moments of my life. And so fast forward to 2017, when Rob and I, along with Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico, a great advocate for the Rio Grande, will return to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the expedition. Bipartisan paddling in Big Bend. I like the sound of that. So with that, let's turn to Senator Rob Portman, and let's get down to some business.
First of all, is it amazing that we look just the same?
Yeah, I know.
We haven't changed it at all.
Yeah, it's nice you think that.
Extraordinary.
That's what the fog of memory can do. Yeah. So, Rob, you play a big role in all things energy as a member of the Senate Energy Committee and also, importantly, a member of the Senate Finance Committee. Talk a little bit about your work, including, very currently, the pending energy bill and the energy efficiency title that you've been pushing.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and I saw Jay earlier. I thanked him for doing this every year, and I've heard about it through Corey Gardner and Mike Bennett, and it's nice to see it and have a chance to participate a little bit. Yeah, I am very involved right now because we have an energy bill on the floor, and it includes as Title I the Portman-Shaheen energy efficiency bill, which is why I'm going to hide my plastic bottle right now, which you should hide yours too.
Yeah, we better do that.
I can't believe he's got plastic out here.
Yeah.
You know, he's the Democrat.
We're supposed to use those metal containers.
But yeah, we're moving on legislation. Some of you are very involved with it, and there are some people in this room who've helped a lot on the energy efficiency bill through the years. For 4 years now, we've been trying to get the more comprehensive bill passed. We passed a couple parts of it, but it helps in terms of manufacturing. It helps in terms of the federal government, housing stock, commercial buildings. It's the equivalent, they say, in terms of emissions being reduced, of taking 21 million cars off the road in 15 years, and saves a lot of money for the people I represent, the taxpayers, of course, both because of the energy efficiency changes to the federal government, but also because of the reduced cost because of some of the efficiency measures, particularly in the building sector. But it's also interesting because it doesn't lose jobs. In fact, it creates jobs. And based on the analysis that we have, it creates about 150,000 jobs. So it should be a no-brainer, right? We've had it to the floor twice. We haven't been able to get it done because there's always something in Washington that makes it more difficult. But this time, I think third time's going to be a charm, and we'll get it done. The broader bill modernizes a lot of energy issues. It does deal with liquefied natural gas. It codifies a lot of what I think Secretary Moniz would already like to do and is doing with regard to these permits. But it does put in place the ability for us to be able to have some certainty that we're going to be able to be an exporter of natural gas. I think that'll help in terms of some of the infrastructure that many of you are involved with the LNG export terminals. And then there's also a number of things that have become bipartisan over time, which is good, modernizing in the nuclear power area, in the hydro area, and so on. We've kept some controversial stuff out because we want to keep it bipartisan. It got out of the committee with an 18-4 vote. And I'm hopeful that next week we'll pass it on the floor of the Senate. And there's a companion bill in the House. It's a little different. One example of that is, since this is the North American Conference, we'll talk about that. I think the House bill is a little stronger, frankly, in terms of the ability to coordinate, particularly with Canada and Mexico, on infrastructure, which we can talk about, and maybe if you want to talk North America later. But I do think there's a possibility in conference with the House to be able to go even a little bit further in terms of the general topic here today, as I heard Gary talk about, which is this notion of having better integration between Canada, Mexico, and the United States.
Good. So that's an example of that all too rare opportunity in Washington where you're actually going to get some legislation done. So much of what we hear about Congress these days relates to gridlock. And so what does it normally take to get things done these days? And have things changed with the arrival of House Speaker Ryan? Have you been able to work with President Obama? What's the latest situation in that?
Yeah, we're all sure that once President Trump takes over, everything's going to be fine. So it's really not, it's going to be great. I mean, just not just fine. I say fine, great.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Look, it's frustrating. I mean, there's a lot that can and should get done. Some of these energy issues we talked about earlier are, again, not terribly complicated and really nonpartisan almost. We should get them done. We can talk more about some of the things that Mike Bennett and I are doing in terms of carbon sequestration, carbon capture. So I do think that Paul Ryan is a breath of fresh air in a sense. He's coming to this job, saying he's going to focus on policy issues. I'm close to him, so maybe I'm biased, but I think he's looking not for partisan issues, but for issues where you can find common ground on policy. And that's what he's been talking about. I think we now have something like 47 of our bills that I've authored or co-authored that have been signed into law by President Obama. So it's not that nothing's getting done. Some of the big things are left undone, including dealing with our debt and deficit, which we all should be concerned about as citizens of this great country, because we're heading again toward record levels of debt as a percent of our economy, and we have to deal with that issue. And then on the issue of the economy, we heard yesterday that the economy grew 0.7% in the fourth quarter, another anemic quarter, meaning that this year will be almost exactly, last year, 2015 will almost be exactly 2014's numbers. Disappointing. That's one reason you don't see wages going up and you don't see the kind of growth we want. Energy has been a big part of, frankly, keeping some growth out there. Without the energy revolution, really, in the last few years, think of where we'd be. So I do think there's a need to do some things in that area, too. One would be tax reform. There's some companies here in this room that have a big interest in this because, there's so much money locked up overseas now with our antiquated and inefficient tax code, but this has become a partisan issue, unfortunately. So there's some things that we can and should do that are the bigger things that aren't getting done. By the same token, some of us are having success and working across the aisle and getting things done, including the energy efficiency legislation we talked about.
Well, one of those topics that still, I think, divides the Senate is climate change. What will it take to bridge this difference? And are there climate solutions that can reach broad-scale agreement in the Senate and more broadly nationwide?
Yeah, I do think there are, and I'm biased because we're in the middle of this process of working on this efficiency bill, but the energy efficiency bill will help in terms of emissions, as I said. It's one where the White House and Democrats in the House and Senate and Republicans are more or less in agreement. Some Republicans don't want to go as far as our legislation goes because it's a pretty significant federal role in some areas, including, as I mentioned, some of the technology for manufacturing, for instance. But I think there's a real opportunity to work with the House to get something done. Another that I think Senator Bennett's coming tomorrow to speak to this group, and he and I have a bill that actually Dan has helped us with quite a bit. Some of you have been involved with who are involved in power generation. But it basically provides an incentive through a tax preference for some of the big upfront costs that are involved in carbon sequestration and capture. And so this is one where I think there's a bipartisan effort here to say, let's at least provide some incentive here. Private activity bonds is what we use specifically, so it comes through my Committee of Finance as well as through the Energy Committee. And I think there's a good opportunity here. The opportunity to use some of this CO2 for oil recovery is something exciting, I think. I'm told some of you are very involved in this already. It's being used already, but here's an opportunity, so it's valuable. And I'm not suggesting it's the one solution, but I do think it'll help in terms of retrofitting some of these plants and providing some incentive for the upfront costs. The final one that I'll mention that Dan and I know a lot about because we've worked on it over the years and some of you have is this notion of dealing with deforestation, because the third or fourth cause of CO2 emissions in the world is the burning of forests. Some say it's third after power plants and transportation. Right. And we don't pay much attention to it, but there's quietly been legislation that has been passed in Congress that has helped a lot. This is the Debt for Nature legislation some of you know about. It's called the Tropical Forest Conservation Act. We believe that we have protected over 68 million acres of forest, which is the equivalent of about, 80 million metric tons a year of CO2, and that's a fairly conservative estimate. There's some people here that know more about the science than I do in terms of how that's calculated. But that would be the equivalent of about taking 17 million cars off the road every year. This is an annual number. And that's not cost any jobs. And that's one where Republicans and Democrats should be able to come together and say this is not bad for the economy. It does cost some money because you do these debt for nature swaps with these countries that have debt to the United States. You say, okay, we'll relieve your debt, but in exchange for that, you got to protect these forests, which is in all of our interests because this is the air we all breathe. And so I think there's opportunity there. I know there's opportunity there. That legislation is needing a reauthorization, so I'm involved with that. I'm the co-author of that. I was the author of the legislation originally way back in the House 15 years ago, maybe. Right. So my point is, sometimes we get stuck on the regulatory side, and being from Ohio, I can tell you the combination of about 5 of these regulations from EPA are having a detrimental impact on us economically. The numbers are clear. It's job loss. It's electricity costs going up. That does result in job loss. It's affecting our ability to be competitive in terms of a manufacturing state. So we got to work through those issues carefully. But in the meantime, there is some low-hanging fruit where I think we can find consensus.
So another area of consensus, I think, is natural gas, and it's a big focus of this conference. Where do you see us headed with natural gas? Is it a bridge fuel? Is it part of the answer? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we're obviously very excited about it in Ohio because God kindly placed 2 shale finds under our ground. So Marcellus and Utica have, changed eastern Ohio. And Marcellus, because it's mostly just dry natural gas, has not been as much in the news recently, although some of you are involved in Marcellus, more probably in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. But Utica has been an enormous boon to our economy in Ohio. And as I said earlier, think what the global economy or our U.S. economy would be like, and therefore the global economy over the last several years without this, as I mentioned, energy revolution. It's the new technology that allows us to access this natural gas. So from an economic point of view, absolutely. It's helped us in terms of manufacturing in Ohio, too. We've been able to bring back some industry. And, it's exciting because we have the opportunity to, once again, become a manufacturing powerhouse with this not just lower price, but more accessible energy. Our challenge in Ohio, and by the way, we now have 14 rigs in Ohio as compared to 48 a year and a half ago. So obviously with the pricing of natural gas, and there are lots of natural gas and oil folks here who follow this market very carefully and understand the consequences, even to have 14 rigs left is better than it was probably 6 months ago. So we're seeing, and it's probably because some of you are being a lot more efficient. and your suppliers are being more efficient. That's what I hear, at least from the folks in Ohio who are now drilling again, is that there's a way to make money, even at these low prices. And the prices have seen somewhat of a bump from their low. So we're excited. We believe that it's a long-term play for us and for our country. The emissions are less, about 50% of the emissions, maybe 60% of the emissions, depending on the use, transportation or power. But we do think it's a great opportunity. Our biggest challenge, Dan, is infrastructure. And having the certainty to know we're going to have the infrastructure to be able to move this product where it needs to go. And that goes also to the North American challenge that we have. Mm-hmm. You and I talked about the FAST Act earlier, and in this transportation bill, we were able to get a permitting reform bill passed, and some of you were involved in that and know about it. Some of you might be surprised to learn it's actually going to help a lot with regard to energy companies, particularly oil, natural gas, wind, solar, because it takes so long to permit something now, and there's a lot of legal liability attached to it. We moved the statute of limitations, from 6 years to 2 years, for instance, which is very important on the liability front. And we require now one agency to be accountable and one agency to be in charge, to know what's going on, much more transparency, to have that ability, to be able to understand where your project is and to move it forward. And some deadlines. They're sort of soft deadlines, but this is really going to help to move projects forward. And I'm excited about that, and we need it in Ohio. And then in this energy bill that's on the floor now, we focus more on pipelines and trying to do the same thing with regard to some of the pipeline projects. And again, the House goes even further with regard to some of its legislation, particularly on the pipelines that are interstate pipelines, but also international pipelines, particularly coming from Canada, and transmission lines, mm-hmm. to be able to, again, make that permitting process more efficient. And I think that's, frankly, our next challenge and next hurdle we have, both in Ohio and around the country.
So that ended up in legislation at the end of last year, and that's
Right.
going to be overseen by whom? How's that going to get implemented for folks in this?
Well, every agency and department will have to deal with it, but OMB has a role to supervise it. The Council of Environmental Quality has a role as well. We negotiated it carefully with the administration. It took us about 3 or 4 years to do this. It was supported, by the way, by the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers and the energy industry, but it was also supported by the AFL-CIO Building Trades Council. And they were very effective lobbyists, I will tell you, to get a lot of Democrat support for it because it's about jobs. And it's about the U.S. falling behind. It wasn't too many years ago, we were about 13th or 14th in the world based on the World Bank study in terms of the ease of doing business as it relates to permitting, green-lighting a project. Now, I think in the last one, we were number 41. Think about that, 41st in the world in terms of permitting. And this is because of this overlay of different agencies and departments and different permits. For some energy projects, as you know, we can have up to 30 different permits. And our legal liability also is greater than many of these other countries, including, by the way, some emerging countries that are sort of looking at what we're doing and what other countries are doing and saying, we're going to leapfrog these guys. We're going to come up with more efficient ways to move this capital to our country because it is, it's a global business now. Capital will flow to where there's an infrastructure project that can get built in a relatively short period of time so that capital's not that patient, and we were losing out and continue to lose out. So this needs to be implemented properly. We're watching it carefully. OMB will play a big role in here in coordinating with the agencies. Council of Environmental Quality also has a role in this, as I said. And we're hopeful that this will enable us to get more investment in the United States in infrastructure and help to deal with some of the issues I mentioned earlier in terms of our energy infrastructure challenges.
But you're comfortable that you can accelerate this, make the process more efficient, but at the same time ensure that?
There still will be all these reviews, and the NEPA review will occur, and the question is, again, with regard to this issue of the statute of limitations I talked about, instead of 6 years after the NEPA review is completed, a 6-year statute of limitations, it goes to 2 years. And that just gives people who want to invest in these projects a little more confidence and comfort that they're not going to be sued, 3, 4, 5, 6 years after the review is done. So this is an opportunity. And by the way, I think Fred Krupp is here. The environmental groups worked with us. NRDC supported this legislation. We worked with them to ensure that we were going to have safety and environment concerns addressed. It's a compromise. It's not everything, frankly, the House wanted. The House passed legislation that was more aggressive in terms of setting hard deadlines. I mentioned soft deadlines earlier. But it'll help. I'm convinced of it, and particularly if it's properly implemented. And that's one thing we all have to watch. And And if we don't do this, again, this investment's going to go somewhere else.
Right.
So it's a great opportunity for us in the energy front. As I mentioned, solar, wind, oil and gas, all the energy infrastructure projects will be helped, but it's also good for other projects, commercial buildings, for instance.
Good. So a big focus of this conference is on North American energy opportunities, how Canada, Mexico, the U.S. are increasingly working together, how we're integrating our energy systems and cooperating in a whole host of ways. Do you see this as an important element of U.S. energy policy? And what do you think can be done to accelerate this kind of integration, this kind of collaboration?
Yeah, I do, and I'm sure you'll have some experts talking about what's going on, but it's pretty exciting. Mexico now sends us electricity. I'm told that recently we became a net exporter to Mexico of oil. Who'd have thunk, you know? But this shows, you know, we have a mutual interest in having our energy sectors work together, certainly with Canada, with the pipeline issues that came up with Keystone XL, you know, it's sort of a sore spot right now. And I think there's some people here who have some strong views on that, probably on both sides. But I hope what we can do is kind of get over that issue and decide, okay, how are we going to decide how these international infrastructure projects, transmission lines, pipelines are dealt with. Obviously, the Keystone project was a mess. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of stop and start. And again, the House has legislation to do this that goes a little further than what the Senate has. But even in our legislation that's on the floor of the House right now, we have ways to be able to provide more certainty in the permitting process. So I was a big supporter of getting Keystone approved. I thought it was the right thing to do. But I think now that we're sort of to the next level, we ought to come up with a strong policy that takes an antiquated approach that was in place when Keystone was started and permitted, attempted to be permitted, and to apply it to future projects. So I think that's going to help. And I also think there's an opportunity here for us to help the world in this way. You know, one of the things that I think is more and more obvious is that energy is a national security issue, and it's a tool, and it's a weapon sometimes that's used by other countries. Russia has used it with Ukraine, and now with Europe. Iran is now talking about exporting natural gas. I imagine that they won't do it strictly on a commercial basis. And it would be good to have the opportunity for countries like Ukraine to be able to have other sources of energy. And also to keep the price reasonable. So if there is another source, even if it's not easily accessible because they don't have a port or they don't have the infrastructure, at least the global market reacts when there's the opportunity to access, whether it's Canadian, Mexican, or U.S. supplies. So that's one thing I'm happy about in the energy bill that's on the floor right now. Again, it makes it easier to export natural gas. It also really codifies what Secretary Moniz would like to do anyway, as I understand it.
Right.
But it gives us some certainty going forward, which will have a national security implication as well.
So let's switch gears quickly. You were in a competitive re-election back home in Ohio, running against former Ohio Governor Strickland. How's that race going? How are you feeling about things?
I can't believe he brought that up. You know, I was just feeling good. You know, I don't know. The election's only, 8 months? 8 months, 2 weeks, 3 days, 4 hours. Not that I'm counting.
Right.
But I think it's going fine. It's a presidential year. You never know, Dan. You know, this is a very interesting and exciting presidential cycle as we're seeing, but also creates an awful lot of uncertainty. But you know, we're feeling good about our prospects because we're doing the right things, doing a lot of grassroots, doing a lot of online stuff, and we're working real hard in Washington on good policy. You know, we'll hopefully have the energy efficiency bill signed into law, but also we have legislation to deal with drug addiction that I've worked on for many years that we think we can get marked up in the Judiciary Committee next week. For 3 years we've been asking for this, and so that's what I'm really busiest on right now, is just focusing on doing the job and getting things done. And you know, I'm proud of the fact that we've gotten a lot done. And as a Republican, sometimes I go to Republican gatherings and folks say, well, how can you work with President Obama? And I say, well, here's the things I did. What do you think about these? Look at them. Don't look at it from a partisan point of view. You know, do you think that it's good to have permitting reform, for instance, or more efficient use of our energy, not just producing more, which I totally support, but also using it more efficiently? And so that's what I view as my job, is to get stuff done, not to give speeches and throw out the red meat, but to actually get things done for the people I represent.
Well, speaking of red meat, we do have a presidential race going on with Mr. Sanders at one end of the spectrum, Mr. Trump and Cruz at the other end, and a lot of sharp elbows in between. Any quick thoughts, lofty, humorous, or otherwise?
Oh my gosh. The one thought is that John Kasich is running, who's my governor, and I will actually be in New Hampshire on Sunday with John Kasich at a few town hall meetings. And so anybody who's interested in supporting a presidential candidate on the Republican side, go Kasich, all right?
All right.
It's now become a campaign event for John Kasich.
So, Mr. Portman, will we see you on the Republican ticket as somebody's VP?
No.
Well, that was easy.
No, I think I'll focus on winning my Senate race. And, you know, as you say, it's a challenging environment, and you never know. So we're going to work very hard to do that so we can have the opportunity to continue to serve Ohio and to get some of these things done we talked about today. And again, I appreciate being at the conference because it's fun to talk to people who are actually in the business, in the trenches, on the business side, and people who are doing the research and you know, doing the academic studies, and never hesitate to come tell us. Dan doesn't hesitate, I can tell you, to bend my ear. But we want to hear from you. We have had a lot of support from the people in this room on the energy efficiency bill, even though some of you, arguably, if you're in the power generation business or providing power, might think, gosh, why won't we be more efficient? But people get it. You know, we want to be more efficient because it's the right thing to do for the people we represent. It's the right thing to do for our economy. It's the right thing to do for the environment. And you know, we can make progress. The Energy Committee is a little more nonpartisan or bipartisan than some of the other committees I'm on, like the Budget Committee. But it's great to be here to talk to folks about some of the issues, and hope you all stay in touch. Never hesitate to let us know what your views are.
Good. So let's be efficient and take a couple of questions in our remaining couple of minutes. So are we going to the mics? Ah, that's being very efficient. All right.
Dan didn't write that, did he?
All right, Senator, you know how to run a government given your role at OMB. What's it going to take, in your opinion, to get our budgetary issues front and center and on a path to resolution?
Wow.
Nice, easy question.
Yeah. You know, I mentioned that earlier, and you know, we don't have time to go into all the details, and it's really incredibly boring to talk about budgets. But
you do it a lot.
I do it a lot. But it is, you know, it's amazing to me how little attention it's getting right now. The Congressional Budget Office does a report annually projecting what's going to happen, not just in the year, but over a 10-year period. And they just told us that the projection is a lot worse than it was even 6 months ago when they do the semi-annual one, or a year ago. They have said that we're going to add roughly $10 trillion to the national debt in the next 10 years, to the point that our debt as a percent of the economy, which is really how you ought to look at it probably, because the economy is growing, you can take on some debt, but as a percent of the economy, will be the highest it's ever been, at least since 1 year during World War II, which was very different because we were paying for a war. We could later reduce that spending, and we didn't have these incredible entitlement responsibilities unfunded. So it's a huge issue. And when you look at what the problem is, yes, we have a large Defense Department. Yes, we're a big government. As I mentioned earlier, we're not only the most energy inefficient government probably in the world, but we're also the biggest government in the world. We use more energy, by the way. The government uses more energy than any other entity in the world probably. But the big problem is not the appropriated spending, the annual spending that we all talk about and sort of fight over. That's based on the projections, at least, from what we've done in the last several years, relatively flat. So when you think about the agencies and the departments, and that would include defense spending, what is going up dramatically is the mandatory spending. So the 1/3 of the budget that's now called discretionary spending that you appropriate every year, relatively flat, at least compared to the economy, but the mandatory side grows dramatically. To the point that in a couple of years, by the way, it'll be 3/4 of the budget. So 3/4 of the budget will not be appropriated every year. These spending bills won't touch it. And it's made up of course, the incredibly important programs that have to be sustained, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and interest on the debt, which goes up dramatically in the CBO's projections, even though they assume we're going to keep relatively low interest rates. So if interest rates go up higher, of course, we'll have significantly higher deficits and debt. So this is a huge problem, and the obvious answer is two things. One, you grow the economy, because economic growth is incredibly important. That's how we got to a balanced budget back in 1997, 8, 9, 2000. Second is you have to deal with the mandatory side of the budget and do it in a smart way, and do it in a way that preserves these programs for future generations. In my view, this is the great challenge that we have. I mentioned tax reform earlier as a way to give the economy a shot in the arm. There's other things we can do. The regulatory reforms we talked about today certainly help. Energy, certainly a great way to help boost the economy. Education, worker retraining. But also, on the other side, we've got to figure out a way to deal with this huge growth on the mandatory side. Otherwise, it crowds out all the other spending. And by the way, you literally cannot raise taxes enough to account for this over even the next 10 years. I mean, it's impossible. So Bernie Sanders might say, let's just tax more and spend more and, become more like, actually, the European countries have gone away from socialism, but let's, go back to where they were. You simply can't tax enough to catch up to these numbers. So that is the great challenge that we have.
So last balanced budget under some guy named Clinton. With that, let's give...
And Kasich.
And Kasich, that's right.
Thank you for letting me on, Kasich.
That's right. So let's give this budget nerd a big, big round of applause. Senator Rob Portman. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Well done.
Thank you. It's fun. Move our plastic there.